Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 45th, I'm always getting that wrong, evening talk with Craig Brown in the series of University of Buckingham's fireside talks. They used to take place around the fireside here on Darchy Hall at the university, but now they're all virtual. It's a series also called Great Minds, and it's really wonderful to have Craig with us tonight. Hello, Craig.
Hello. I hope I'm not too fraudulent coming under a Great Minds category, but anyway.
But you are both a great mind and a great life. The only fraudulent part is there's no fireside in sight at the moment.
That's true.
Now, everybody knows who you are, but I want to just say for those who are new to the series, do please ask questions. I'm going to be picking up with Craig questions all the way through. I love to have them. And if you're on a system where you can't just key into the Teams, then if you make a note of this email address, very simple, and send an email to Matt, who's our technician, he will then put it into the system and I'll read it. So the email address, to remember, it should also come up on the screen, is matthew.thompson with a P, Thompson at buckingham.ac.uk, matthew.thompson at buckingham.ac.uk. And do, if you're also new, do pass on the details of these talks to everybody else, so others can hear. Every single guest gives up their time gratis, so it can all be free, which is absolutely marvellous. And I'm sure Dominic Cummings would thoroughly approve. Can't think why though. Moving on, Craig, can you describe the room? Simply because a joy of being able to have a virtual talk is that we can come into the room of the writer, and it's interesting. So where are we, Craig?
Well, we're in Aldborough in our house, which is on the seafront, and this is the downstairs. It's a library. I think it sounds rather pompous calling something a library, but it basically is a library, and there are lots of books. I can show you around it. My machine is sort of plugged in, so I might not be able to do the full 360 degrees, but so lots and lots of books. That proves that I've got lots of books. And then on the other side, going around, there's sort of French windows and a little garden, and then there's the seafront. And here actually I've just seen is a Trivial Pursuit of the Beatles that someone gave me the other day. I don't know if you can see that, but I scored very, very badly, even though I've just done a book about the Beatles. I only got about 3 out of 7 questions.
Well, indeed, we are going to be talking about, in particular, about your book on Princess Margaret. There was a different view of Princess Margaret given by Hugo Vickers on Friday evening. That's part of the joy of the series, looking at how different people see historical figures in different ways, and then indeed the Beatles, who I think we can now call historical figures. But Craig, I think everyone would like to know how you became a writer and a satirist, and did you contemplate this when you were at school? Were you and university? Were you writing satirical pieces? How did it actually start?
Yes, well, I suppose I'm mainly known for parodies, and I was doing parodies at my prep school. I've got a copy of the old prep school magazine, and there are parodies in there. So when I was about 10 or 11. And I think prep school is a sort of much more than public school, secondary school is the place where comic writers are born. I think it's got something to do with being away boarding age 7 or 8 and being cut off from home. So that slightly cuts off your emotional reserves, I think, or bites into them. And then you're surrounded, or at least in those days, you were surrounded by these rather grotesque adults, and the only way to deal with them is rather in the manner of voodoo, to sort of pick them with the pins of satire and parody. So a friend of mine called Charlie Miller and I had a little tape recorder, and we used to just imitate the teachers or the cleaning staff or whoever for a lot of the time. That took me through about 5 years of boarding school.
And any in particular who were giving you material which really gave you confidence?
Well, you see, in those days, this was kind of, I suppose I went there in 1965 and left 1970. So there were still people who'd been in the war, or at least pretended to have been in the war. And so we always suspected some of them of being Nazi spies, even in because in those days, even though it's 20
probably
years,
were.
Yes, they may well have been, yes. And so there were a lot of them were called Major this, and actually no colonels. It was almost all majors or captains. And the headmaster, I mean, actually he was a perfectly innocent man, I think, but rather peculiarly, he wore the school uniform, which was shorts and sandals and an Airtex top. He was a sort of portly man of about 65.
That does,
and so he was kind of
sound a little odd if you...
Yes, I know. When you say it now, it does sound odd. But of course, as a child, you sort of think, well, this is the way the world works.
you know nothing else. And then in 1970, you went to Eton, which must have been full of material.
That was much more, at the start, it's such a sort of big school. I'm just, 1,200, 1,300 pupils, and everyone, even the headmaster, it seems to be quite low down in the pecking order. And so I was rather overawed by the hierarchical nature of Eton, I suppose. But I sort of got into my stride. And the great thing about Eton is, as well as having some very good teachers, is amazing facilities. So it's a very good theatre and very good magazine, and you're just about to allowed to write what you want. And you can write a bad review of a school play and that kind of thing, which is quite rare. And even now, it's quite rare in a school, I think.
So satire and parody, can you just explain how they work, and why have they had such a long history in human experience? There's always been satire.
Yeah, there's always been satire, and actually a lot of the time, especially in England, it's been much more savage than it is now. If you see those cartoons of Gilray, Rowlandson, they're super tough, and there's stuff which I think even in satirical magazines, sort of cartoons, which are so disgusting, I'm not sure they would be printed nowadays. And yeah, so I think it's one of the rich. I think, in a way, cynicism is one of the great things that Britain has given to the world, and maybe giving it even more as we go into a sort of imperial decline. And
you went through university, and then how did Private Eye?
I didn't really go through. I sort of touched on university, but I didn't actually get a degree. I did drama for a bit. I wanted to be a playwright, and then for no good reason, I was doing it at Bristol, which had a very good drama department. For no good reason, I left after 2 years when I should have just stayed on and done the third. But I think I was anxious to kind of get going. And then I sort of became a freelance journalist, sort of slightly thinking I'll become a playwright in time. But now I'm rather glad, reading something like Simon Gray's diaries, I'm rather glad I didn't become a playwright, because I think it's a very tough job, even when you're doing well, like Simon Gray was doing well. But, it's a pretty tough life, I think. And so I'm glad I stuck with journalism.
Incredibly tough, and as it is, getting an income out of it, unless you are a Tom Stoppard, I guess.
And even with Tom Stoppard, I think, he had a play coming on, or was there a play already on, and then the coronavirus hits, and that's it. There isn't any theatre at the moment. I mean, that's tricky.
With Leopoldville. So how did you institutionalize this and start making this this early prep school interest into a source of income and a career?
Well, actually, I started off doing rather kind of serious literary journalism. So the TLS, for instance, was one thing I wrote for. I think my first article was in the New Statesman. So I sort of, in a way, I went from serious to more light-hearted. I mean, I don't actually make, in proper terms, I don't make any distinction really between serious and humorous, and that I think a lot of things are mistaken for serious, which it's just another word for being pompous or lacking levity or phrasing things in a dull way. Dullness is often mistaken for seriousness, I think.
Why did that satire explode in the early 60s when Private Eye was founded in or about 1961, and Beyond the Fringe, and That Was the Week That Was? Was it that people suddenly became ridiculous, or that there was a gifted group together?
I think they were the immediate sort of post-war generation. There's a tiny bit older than the Beatles, say. And I think if you see, there's a sketch in Beyond the Fringe where they're poking fun at the sort of war ethos. It's not actually poking fun at people who served in war, but you can see it was considered outrageous at the time. And there was a sort of the generation rebelling against the parents who had been in the war. And so I suppose that was the thing. And the first sort of glimmers of kind of freedom, of sexual freedom, and the anti-establishment feeling, so I suppose they personified that, and it is still very refreshing. It was a very, I mean, old Private Eyes are still funny, and certainly all the Alan Bennett, Peter Cook stuff is still very, very good, I think, and that's very rare for comedy to last.
How come it has lasted? It will have its 60th birthday coming up next year, when so many other things have gone. I mean, so many television series and
Are you talking about Private Eye? Or,
sorry, Private Eye. Yeah,
I didn't realise it was 16 next year. I think it's lasted first because it's so alive to the goings on, and so there's always new stuff to write about because there's always a new Home Secretary, or there's always a sort of Meghan Markle, or so that keeps it kind of young and in tune, but also kind of paradoxically, because it's looked the same for the last 60 years, just about. It's in a way, it's the most conservative thing in that the typeface is the same. It went into colour, 15, 20 years ago. So, but apart from that, it looks very much the same. And it's still done on that sort of cheap paper, and it's only about £2. It's much less than buying a daily paper. And so it still has that sort of samizdat quality to it. And yeah, so it's an interesting combination of things. And they've always had very, talented cartoonists, talented writers, and also a very good investigative team at the back, So it has this bedrock of solid journalism, which has had a huge amount of scoops over the years.
Why are some people, some politicians, public figures, more targets than others, and are any not targets? Are some public figures lead lives which are so exemplary, there's nothing that you can parody, the Private Eye can parody?
I think the ones who are hard to do and so sort of get away with things are the ones who are too boring. I mean, it became a slight joke with John Major. His boringness was turned into his feature. But I think you can, if you look around, the cabinet ministers who are really gone for, they tend not to be the boring ones. They're the sort of lots of other things. They might be very nasty, or they might be very hesitant or weak, but the boring ones tend to be let off because people don't really notice them, and people don't know what to do. Because if you're doing a parody of someone who's boring, it's very likely to be boring to read. So that's a tricky thing to get. I remember George Osborne saying that what politicians politicians didn't mind looking savage or ghastly or ugly, as long as they looked quite powerful. But it was only if they were portrayed by caricaturists as weedy, like David Steele, famously, being made to look as if he was much smaller than David Owen when he was actually much bigger, or not much bigger, but he was big. And I think that's what they dread, being seen as minor.
Are there any times that you personally or private eye pull back because you don't want to hurt people's feelings, or does that?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think yes, quite a lot. I mean, I don't go out to certainly in my own. I can't speak for everyone in private eye, but I very rarely want to. I think if you set out actually to hurt someone's feelings, if you're doing a parody, you're not going to really get the parody right, because the parody is using their voice to do something else, to do something humorous. And if you're really setting out to savage them, you won't be listening to their voice. You won't be. I mean, that's not to say I haven't hurt people, and I have once or twice hurt people unintentionally. But you can't tell whether someone will enjoy it, or, I mean, some people are pleased to be parodied and some people are less pleased, but I think most of mine aren't that vicious, or they're not intended to be that vicious.
They're not. One-on-one, I mean, a whole number of books, we won't have time to look at them all, but one-on-one was interesting. Tell us about that.
Well, yes, that was, it was almost like a parlor game. It's always, it was basically, it was a daisy chain of 101 meetings, which were completely true, and it was entirely factual. And actually, there are jokes in it, but because it had to be completely factual, it's not a sort of laugh out loud book. And so it would go from, say, Rudyard Kipling meeting Mark Twain meeting Helen Keller meeting Martha Graham meeting Madonna meeting Michael Jackson, and Michael Jackson meeting Nancy Reagan. So I could almost do the 101. And in each one of those, I did a description of the meeting in 1,001 words. So I gave it this structure, quite severe structure. And I think it worked. It certainly is like any other book. I mean, it's a peculiarity anyway.
It's a very clever idea. And then followed the commission work of 1966 and all that.
Yes, I think that was actually before. It was commissioned in that a publisher came to me with the idea, which I think by and large probably isn't a good idea to. I think something should come from yourself. But I think I did. Oddly enough, my father had been taught at Charterhouse by, was it either Sellers or Yeatman or both? Anyway, one of them was a history master at Charterhouse in, I suppose, the 1930s, early 1930s. And they'd done this brilliant book, 1966 and all that, which is still very funny and still in print and still flourishing, quite rightly. And it's actually, it was, the idea was to do it an update from the First World War onwards. And it's such a subtle joke, theirs, that I kept having to sort of remind myself, what is the joke? It's something, and it's a very clever joke. And I did it, I think I did it all right. There are certainly funny bits in it. And there are jokes which there's one joke I can think of, which is, as far as I can see, original. There are very few original jokes in the world. So I think if you get one original joke in a book.
So who or what, Craig, makes you most laugh?
I like performers, really. Harry Hill, I find the nonsense comedians, Tommy Cooper, Harry Hill, Tim Vine. I like ones they're almost like abstract painters. Or you could say P.G. Wodehouse is like that. They don't do jokes about things. So they're completely unsatirical. You couldn't convert their jokes into a serious sentence. So to remove the joke, if you remove the joke, there wouldn't be anything. So it's purely the joy of the musical joy of language and that kind of thing. And so I think that's what I like. I like kind of pure comedy.
And the books that make you laugh most and smile most?
I like the Simon Gray diaries. I like a lot of. I'm a great diary reader because I love that idea. You're seeing something day to day, and the person who's writing the diary doesn't know what's going to happen next. And I think Simon Gray's diaries are great brilliance. And same Alan Bennett's plays. I suppose of anyone who who's been alive all during my lifetime. I suppose Alan Bennett's plays. I mean, Tom Stoppard, I think, does marvelous stuff. So a lot of playwrights, I think, have been very clever. Michael Frayn, Jeff Dyer, I think, is a marvelous writer. I don't know if you've read a book called Out of Sheer Rage. Have you read Out of Sheer?
No, I've read him. I've read him on Tiepfar on the First World War, but not on
Oh yeah. Well, this is a book about. It's meant to be a book about a biography of D.H. Lawrence, but it's actually a book about not writing a biography of D.H. Lawrence. It's about not getting down to things, and it is. That's a marvelous book. I so recommend that. Yeah,
I'll definitely look at it. And the Tony Years came out, I think, in 2006.
Yes, that was. I have done a few books of journalism, and that was called the Tony Years because it took place in the kind of Blair years, and so there was quite a lot about politics, but lots about other things, and a few serious book reviews and that sort of things. I do about a third of my writing isn't really humorous or isn't intended to be humorous, and so I've bunged some serious stuff in.
And you write in this room here where we're talking to you?
Yeah, sometimes it's quite a tall house, so I sometimes go up to the top room. There's a desk up there, but in summer it's too bright if you're writing on a screen, so I descend to the gloomier room downstairs.
Okay, now everyone's wanting you to get on to the Beatles on the questions, which we're going to do. But I'm just going to say before then, you had surely the best job in the world for a time, and maybe again, which is being a restaurant critic, which is, I mean, writing is a fantastic thing to do, and if you're paid for it, then that's all the better. But then to be a restaurant, I mean,
yes, but you mustn't forget
like about that.
Well, when I did it, everyone said, "Oh God, that's the best job in the world." But of course, other people have. I mean, the thing is, you're not paid to eat; you're paid to write about eating. Yeah. So there is a difference. Obviously, if you're just paid to gobble down food, it would be the best job in the world. But actually, the language, especially the language of taste. So ways of describing food is pretty limited, and I mean, I enjoyed it, but that was largely because I sort of ignored the food side of it. So I just reported on the goings on in the restaurant and my feelings in the restaurant.
So what's been your most enjoyable meal and why?
Actually, I always just like going to, the minute I gave up reviewing restaurants, I just used to go back to the same restaurants that I went to before. So I'm not really interested in experiencing
it's the whole ambience.
Yeah, and you like somewhere you feel cozy in, and where I like it when they serve you drinks straight away. That seems to be an important part of a restaurant, rather than waiting quarter of an hour, signalling. But apart from that, I don't have any great demands.
And give us a secret restaurant, as long as people looking at this promise not to go there and spoil your solitude.
There aren't. That was another thing I'd forgotten. People always thought, oh, well, you have there's a marvelous restaurant sort of tucked away in the woods somewhere, which no one else knows about. But of course, the good restaurants tend to be the ones that survive. Tend to be very popular. Otherwise, they close down. An amazing amount of restaurants close down within a year. And so I think I like those big bustling London restaurants, like the Wolseley or that chain. I'm very happy in those.
And we're going to do Margaret. I was going to pick up Alex Bremer on the title of, subject of what's your favourite. And Alex, who is a Brighton College alumni, says, Craig, tell me, what's your favourite Beatles album? No hesitation.
Abbey Road, the second side of Abbey Road, I think. The sort of the medley, that's the one I'd sort of hear over and over again. And it's got all the qualities of the Beatles. It's got lovely harmonies. It's got that amazing variety, which I think is, in a way, the thing which singles them out as a group. That the variety of emotions, and the way they can go from sentimental to harsh and melodic to shouty, and so that seems to have everything.
We'll come back to the Beatles in a moment, but we're going to do Princess Margaret. Fisher, right. I mean, what can be said in her in her favour?
Well, in her favour, she was a successful mother, I think, judging by her children. They seem to be. I mean, I don't know either of them, but they seem sort of well-rounded. And everyone really, especially people like her daughter Sarah, a lot. Everyone I know who knows her liked her, and she inspired loyalty among her close friends who tended, which might have helped it. They tended to be her ladies in waiting, but she did have some very loyal friends, and she could also be very unkind, but she could be very kind, and certainly she was being very kind to AIDS sufferers before Princess Diana, and she was pretty early onto it. So she did secret acts of kindness. I was also actually rather drawn to her spiritual side, but you can only do things on evidence if you're writing. That's one of the troubles being a writer. But I saw these intimations. She would write hymns or that kind of, and so I think that would be an interesting side to her, and I think it was quite a deeply felt side to her.
Was she hurting? What went wrong? It's clearly the life that she had wasn't the life that you would have expected from the Queen's sister.
Well, I think when you say I don't want to sound like a kind of. I mean, I think Hugo Vickers would. I didn't. He's a friend of mine, but I didn't see him interviewing. But he'd probably be blowing more of a trumpet for her. But I think there is when you say what went wrong, I think a lot of people remember her last sort of 2 years, where she had a terrible accident, and that was completely, it was an accident, and so she went downhill very quickly afterwards. And I think people are always tempted to see that like a kind of Victorian melodrama where someone is being punished for their sins. And I think that's unfair. I think it was just very bad luck. I mean, you could say, well, what went wrong? Why was she so unlike the Queen? And obviously that's got something to do with being the second child. It's got something to do with, I mean, a number of people told me something which you wouldn't have thought would be true, but they said it was, that she really disliked falling down the ranks of the succession. So when she was born, she was something like third in line to the throne. Then what? And she might have gone, maybe she was fourth, and then she went up to third. But after that, once Prince Charles and people were being born, and then Prince Edward, and then their children, she was dropping, and she didn't like that. And I think, and you can see it might be happening even with Prince Harry, that you're born into this great position of power or something like power, and then you're slipping further and further away, and you're having to not genuflect to people who are younger than you, but you're down the order of precedence. So and I think that affected her. I mean, there were other things like drink and she was basically a showbiz person in a non-showbiz role, I think.
So that must have been difficult for her. So before we leave her, what surprised you, Craig, when researching that book? And it's an extraordinary book, and I'd recommend it to everybody. What surprised you most? One good thing and one less good thing about it.
I was surprised, actually, even though that's why I thought it'd be interesting to write a book after doing one-on-one, which is 101 different meetings. I thought my idea was to write a book where it was all about different people meeting one person. So that was the idea. It'd be like a kind of companion volume. But then what surprised me and what made me have to change that was that all the meetings seemed to be roughly go along the same lines, or at least 80% of them. These illustrious strangers meeting Princess Margaret, and she had this odd thing, the more she drank, the more formal she became, so the less casual. And so by the end of the evening, she could be very, very haughty and difficult, as well as having made everyone wait 2 hours before they could eat because she wanted to carry on drinking or smoking and that kind of thing. And I was just surprised that all these meetings went in the same way, which made it impossible to write a book like that, because it would just be like reading the same chapter over and over again, though with different characters involved. So I think that surprised the amount of people who had unhappy memories of what would have been kind of formal meetings. It was often, she was rude to people who were just lining up to shake hands with her. Or there was an old Matthew Paris in his autobiography, remembers going as a young Conservative MP to, I think it was an old folks' home they were opening with Princess Margaret, and they showed her, they'd made coronation chicken for her, and she just said, "That looks like sick." I mean, unbelievable rudeness to completely innocent people. And so those things surprised me.
Unhappy people can be rude.
Yeah.
So can drunk people. The light in her life.
The lights in her. I think she did. Obviously, her marriage to Snowden was very deeply unhappy. I think more him to blame than her. That was happy at the beginning, and I think the Roddy Llewellyn romance, actually, which was always seen as slightly ridiculous at the time, but I think that had a kind of purity to it, and they were loyal to each other and liked one another.
On to the Beatles, 1, 2, 3, 4, another great book. I hope everyone has either read it already or will do so. Why did you choose that? Can you share that?
Well, I think the main thing about the Princess Margaret book, or the thing which makes it different from other royal books, is the structure. It's not done as a sort of a normal biography. It doesn't follow normal chronology. There are sort of bits and bobs popping up all over the place, things about the words which were around at the time, or odd bits of just little essays and bits and pieces. So I wanted to do the same kind of structure, these very short chapters.
Yeah.
With the Beatles. And of course, the Beatles are inherently more interesting than Princess Margaret. I think each of them is more interesting. And then there are 4 of them. And then they have this, I actually, it was only after when I've been thinking about it recently, I just thought this is actually the great 20th century story. It's got everything. It's got a sort of pantomime or a completely traditional narrative structure of people coming from obscurity and poverty, and by the age of 20 becoming the most famous young people in the world, almost the most famous people in the world. And then what happens with the fame, and also what happens with all the people around them are so interesting, like Brian Epstein or the Maharishi or Yoko Ono. And so you have a portrait of an era, and you have these amazing characters, and these and like the Beatles songs, you have this mixture of great sadness with someone like Brian Epstein, and then great joy with, you know, say Paul McCartney when he was staying at the Jane Asher's parents' house for 3 or 4 years, and having this amazingly creative time, just tunes coming out within an hour. They'd often, John and Paul said that they never sat down to write a song without having written a song. I mean, they never had a moment when a song wasn't coming out. Anyway, so it's a story you can't really go wrong with.
So a blended question here from a number is, was the magic, Craig, one individual in particular, say Lennon, or was the magic in the four of them working together? Because and did their separate artistic lives ever achieve the same heights?
Well, quite early on in the book, I say that they were like the four elements, so that John was fire and Paul was water and George was air and Ringo was earth. And I think you need those. So they were, even though Ringo and George might not have been seemingly as essential, I think they were as essential. This strange mix, and the just sheer coincidence of these four people meeting. I mean, one of them, if Paul had not done badly in a Spanish sort of GCSE, then he wouldn't have been kept down a year, and so he would never have met George, or certainly never. And so George was there because Paul did badly in a Spanish GCSE, and so these extraordinary coincidences brought together these four characters, and I think you couldn't remove any of them, even Ringo, and have guaranteed their success. And I think that's borne out by the fact, to come to the second part of the question, that actually they weren't as good afterward. They each had 2 or 3 songs which were memorable after that, or more that were memorable, but were great songs. But and maybe George came more into his own. But you would never play one of their solo albums rather than a Beatles album, I don't think.
So Sarah says, what would you pick out from the post Beatles togetherness that is great?
Songs. I like some of the early John Lennon songs, like "Jealous Guy." I think is a very good. There were quite a lot. I mean, some of their early solo ones they'd actually written while they were in the Beatles. I think Paul's "Maybe I'm Amazed" is a great song, and that could easily have been a Beatles song. And of course, some of the songs, quite a few of the songs in the later Beatles albums were virtually solos. And sometimes they weren't all 4 in the studio, and John and Paul were basically composing separately by the end.
That's interesting. You picked up 2 of my favourite songs there. It's interesting how I wonder about the audience, whether they are for you too. Lee says, what was it that grabbed you when you were writing about the Beatles? What is it about the Beatles?
Well, I think it goes back to what I was saying about it just being an extraordinary story, and that everyone in the world, I mean, including, say, President Johnson or Nixon, or or which I don't know, but I can't guarantee Chairman Mao. But I mean, everyone. I mean, towards the end of the book, I have a thing that Paul, when he went to Russia in sort of the early 2000s, Paul met Putin and he met Gorbachev, and they both said to him how incredibly important the Beatles had been to the youth in the Soviet Union. They'd become a kind of symbol of liberty in the Soviet Union. And that wasn't, I used to think that that's just something people say, to make them sort of sound more important. But actually, yeah, Gorbachev and Putin both acknowledged that.
So Daniel's question comes out of that and says, so I'm a student at Buckingham, and this is some time ago. Can you give me a sense? Was this the most famous and/or the greatest band of all time, or were they one of many? And will there be others again like them?
I suspect that there can't be ones like them as a social phenomena, anyway, because the world is far less concentrated now, so that there are any amount of rap artists or reggae artists or country artists, and people flock to them, or boy groups. And at that time, there wasn't that great separation. And they were both, they started off as a sort of boy group, and then very, very quickly evolved into something much more sophisticated and interesting. And this, I mean, one of the things that surprised me while I was writing it, and still really does, is how quickly they went from, say, I want to hold your hand. It only took kind of 3 or 4 years before they were, it was, why don't we do it in the road? It was, their career was so speedy, and they were so young when it all ended. I think they were all under the age of 30 when the Beatles finished. And so any mistakes they made, I think they can be forgiven because they were just kids.
And Alex come back and said, spot on, Craig, on that album. He, very much agreeing with you there. And Jen is saying, where did you get that? I think you perhaps answered that about your idea for the Beatles, but maybe say something more. And Mark says, which, on a personal level, of the four most interested you? Who would you most want to have got to know? And have you actually met them also? Another question.
Well, no, I haven't met them. I very briefly, I was once at a concert. I was very keen on a group called Grimm's, which had Paul McCartney's brother Mike in it, and Neil Innes, and some of the Bonzo Dogs and the Liverpool Poets. So I used to go to them, and I did see Paul McCartney before one started. This is a Victoria Palace Theatre in about 1972 or something. So I went over to Paul and Linda and said, could I have their autographs? And I was actually carrying a signed photograph of Roxy Music from the night before. And so Paul very pleasantly signed it. With all these Brian Ferry and Eno's autographs, he put, and me too, Paul McCartney. Of course, I've lost it stupidly. And so, and I think Paul would, I don't know if he's the most interesting. Often the most interesting, it wouldn't be necessarily the person you'd want to spend time with. So, I mean, maybe John Lennon was the most interesting, but I think Paul, I admire Paul the most, actually. I think it's terrible that you always have to sort of be Paul versus John, or, the Stones versus the Beatles, everyone. But if I had to choose one, the most singular talent, I think, was Paul's. And I think he was rather hard done by, especially after John died, because suddenly everyone turned John into the saint and Paul into the sinner, because they saw him as too commercial and too friendly in a silly way. But I think his capacity for melody and for lyrics was sort of second to none.
A question here from Simon, again, somebody who's a student. Did Yoko Ono do to John Lennon what Meghan Markle has done to Harry?
Well, we don't know what Meghan
Markle. You will.
We don't know what Meghan Markle's done to Harry. We can imagine, but and it's early days, of course. And I think it's very, I think it's very unfair to blame someone else for what one person does. So it's Harry's decision to marry her, and and same with John and Yoko. However, I mean, people don't like the chapter or two in the book that I've devoted to Yoko because I mean, some people don't, because some people see her as a great heroine and a great modern artist and everything like that. And I take all that with a pinch of salt. I actually, because she, I mean, I should stress that it's not a sort of normal Beatles book, you know, in the same way that the Princess Margaret book wasn't normal. So it might not appeal to every purist. But in the Yoko Ono chapter, because aged 4 or 5, she was on a cruise ship and entered a fancy dress competition as Shirley Temple and got first or second prize. I do quite a long thing comparing her with Shirley Temple and her dud poems to Shirley Temple's rather better lyrics, like The Good Ship Lollipop and things like that. And so I sort of have fun with Yoko Ono.
A question here from Simon asking about drugs and the Beatles. Did drugs help them to be more creative? And do drugs in general help artists to be more creative, or does it make them stupid?
Well, I think you could argue with both in the Beatles, that their worst track, I think you might even agree with this, or not even, you might agree with this, Revolution number 9. Do you remember that incredible?
Well, of course. I mean, we all sat around thinking this was just the very height of art. And how
I bet no one's played it all the way through. I bet no one who's listening tonight played it all the way through recently for pleasure. And so I suppose you could say that was the product of drugs, John and drug. John did take too many drugs. But I don't really like saying this because I don't like the idea that you know, drugs are good for creativity. But I think a lot of their best songs, you know, I Am the Walrus or that kind of thing, Strawberry Fields, were jolly well helped by drugs. And I think they were doing really interesting stuff before anyone else because of drugs and seeing new ways of looking at the world, and so I think, yeah. But if I had to say, if I had to answer the question, did drugs help them or hinder them? I'm afraid the answer would be they helped them.
Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, another example. And a lot of questions now coming in from students studying journalism. Beth is asking, so Craig, you talked earlier about people who are difficult to spoof, but can you say anything more about the type of person who you yourself really find it difficult to get inside?
Well, I think I don't really like doing insincere things. So I like, you know, I like choosing someone to parody for a purpose. I mean, sometimes the purpose no more than that I've felt them irritate me, or but also it has to have someone you can have fun with. So someone who stands for something, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, and you can have a joke about them. Sorry, I now can't remember what the question was.
Well, it was whether you find some people more difficult. So, and for example, if you know, Nigel Farage, you know, or somebody else whose politics you might not agree with.
Yes,
so
I remember one that I couldn't do was someone I so disliked and continue to dislike, which is Jerry Adams. And I wanted to do him. And that's why I think, in a way, I'm not a satirist, I'm a humorist. But I just found my sort of anger getting in the way of the joke. The thing is with parody, it's not just imitating someone or just echoing someone. You're doing something with that echo, and you're turning it into humor.
Okay.
And so you have to kind of get involved in the way, especially with our language. I would see that language is as the path. And so a lot of my parodies will be 70% the original words of the person. And for instance, actually today I was just doing a kind of joke about Meghan and Harry in the Mail. And the Mail are sensitive at the moment because they're being sued by Meghan and Harry. And so they rang up and they said, oh, this quote is an actual quote, or is it one you've made up? And I'd only written it about 2 hours, you know, I'd finished around lunchtime. They rang up about 3:30. And I couldn't remember whether, and they read out the quote, and I couldn't remember whether I'd made it up or they had. So I get to the state when I'm doing parody where I just mash everything up in my mind and then let it, and then I almost, well, like that false psychic Doris Stokes.
Yeah.
I just let their voice come out of me onto the page.
Do you ever feel they're talking through you?
Yes.
Do you find you can get inside people's heads?
Well, I don't know if I can get inside people's head, but I think I can get inside their sort of voices. I can do their voices, but that's not the same as getting inside their heads. And often I'm almost always making jokes about their public front. So it's either something they've written or a broadcast they've done. So it's the way people present themselves to the public that I'm going for. I'm not going into their souls, I hope. I mean, I wouldn't, you know, I couldn't do that.
Questions are coming in inevitably. Craig, can you say more about that distinction you had between being a humorist and a satirist?
Yes, well, I feel that with this satire, you could translate it easily into political speech. And I feel that about a lot of the sort of 6:30 comedy on Radio 4. You think, well, you know, just become an MP if you want to get this point over, rather than try and dress it up in humour. And I think humour is always going for the joke, and you don't have some agenda if you're a humorist. And I think with satire there is an agenda. It might be a perfectly good, you know, bring down the fall of Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. So it might, you know, have a much greater purpose, but that's not what I do. I'm always in pursuit of the joke, of the of merriment, I think.
And another question here: can one be more biting in words or in cartoons?
Well, it's a hard one. I mean, the trouble with cartoons, which I wish I could do, but I can't, is that they're purely on someone's personal appearance. And so you can, you know, so that has severe limitations. I mean, you could be extremely good-looking person, attractive person, and be responsible for ghastly things. And I don't know quite what you do then as a caricaturist, where I can always deal, because I'm dealing in words, I think it gives you far more scope to get closer to the person.
And question inevitably about Donald Trump and where you stand yourself on that, and is he a tremendous gift, and who do you think is wittiest about Trump?
Well, one of the troubles being a humorist, I was quite soon on to Trump. I mean, sort of the minute he was announced his candidature, I mean, obviously lots of people were, but I was doing lots of tweets, fake tweets, and then actually I was doing them quite a lot for Vanity Fair magazine, which is an American magazine. So I felt like, well, I've got the hang of Donald Trump, because this American magazine was buying these parodies. It was pretty, I think they were doing them almost every month, and so I got his voice. But then, you know, he's so much in. After 4 years, he's still. I haven't done his tweets for a while. I haven't done him for a while, because he doesn't bore me now. But you can no longer be surprised by him. You're no longer in front of the flock. Everyone hates Donald Trump. Everyone regards him as vulgar and absurd, and they're quite right to. But I've got nothing to add to that. The person I think is very funny is American comedian called Randy Rainbow, who does these very funny kind of Gilbert and Sullivan style songs, beautifully produced. And he's a very good example of of someone who's essentially silly and doesn't sort of, and it is satire, but he's not sort of being solemn about it. I think it's solemnity.
Okay. That's a good lead there. Cherry is asking about Charlie Hebdo, and you know, what you can't. Is there something? John Lennon died of violent death. There are people of unstable minds. What are the limits there?
Well, I thought Ian Hislop was sensible at the time, that he sort of said, well, you know, he would...
The editor of Private Eye.
The editor of Private Eye. He said, well, he would have nothing against putting in that kind of cartoon, but they weren't funny. They weren't good. They weren't good or amusing cartoons, and that's no reason to murder the people who did the cartoons. So that's not a very coherent thought on Charlie Hebdo. And yes, and because of Mark Chapman murdering Lennon, I don't quite know what. I mean, I don't think he was influenced by any satire or anything like. I mean, he was a fan. I mean, rather good example of, you know, fandom gone mad rather than hatred or love being transformed into hatred. No one quite knows. Actually, there's something controversial I would say about the Mark Chapman thing, that I think he's once again been denied free. He just comes up for parole every now and then. And I don't know if this time, but on all the other occasions, even though it's 40 years on, Yoko Ono, who's always preached love and forgiveness and told us all, she's always stood against his release. Now, you can understand why she would do that. You know, if your husband or wife was murdered, you would feel vengeful, but it's not. I feel there's a certain hypocrisy in her telling the world how to behave and not behaving like that herself.
Interesting. Louise asks, we've just got 2 more questions now. We'll take Laura's and Louise's together. Who says, Laura, do you have a particular technique as a satirist, humorist? Craig. And Louise says, as a writer, which writer do you yourself return to most often?
The writer I return to most often, I suppose, would be John Updike. I mean, you can't pick up a short story or novel by John Updike without taking, you know, delight. There's kind of delight on every page, just his use of language and his the kind of joy of being alive. So that's who I suppose I'd choose my complete favourite. And also he's very sensible. I think as a critic he's very sensible, which is quite rare to be a sort of genius and sensible. My technique, I don't really have a technique as a humorist, and I think if I did, then I'd get rather stale. I mean, that it happens to humorists, and I hope it hasn't happened to me. But you see these techniques being employed over and over again. And you say all branches of kind of entertainment through the art. You can see, you know, opera singers suddenly have to sing in the same way because they've been singing like that forever. And so I hope I don't have a kind of a technique that I can knowingly apply. I sort of chase the language, I suppose. I chase the language.
And Jack will have the last question. We're just running out of time there. And sorry, Jack, we can't have time for your question, which was, what would your Anthony Seldon parody be? Jack, thank you very much. I'll see you in my study tomorrow morning.
And some time ago, but I can't really remember much about it.
And Henry also asks, but also Jack. Yes, I think that Craig's parodies are about people who are worthwhile, and grand though it is to be Vice Chancellor of University of Buckingham, not quite there.
No, if you look up Private Eyes, you will find there an Anthony Seldon parody. I couldn't quote from it, I'm afraid.
Well, thank you very much for reminding everybody about that, Craig. That's very touching. Kind of just quickly pinning you down at the end. One politician you'd most like to have dinner with? Alive or dead?
Sorry, no one at the moment. I mean, actually, I haven't had dinner with Boris Johnson, but I know him slightly, and he's kind of entertaining character. Whether, I mean, obviously that has no bearing on whether he's a good prime minister or not. He quite obviously isn't. And I'm sure that the best prime ministers like Clem Attlee would be slightly boring to have dinner with. So,
yeah. So Boris, and which Beatles band?
I'm only saying Boris because I can't think of any other politician. He's only beat Matt Hancock or the others.
I'm sure he'd be
Stewart. Rory Stewart. I think he's good news.
Rory Stewart, we had. For those who want to look back at interviews, Rory Stewart was very revealing. And finally, which band?
Johnson.
Which band, apart from the Beatles, has most entertained you in your life?
The Kinks. They're not quite equal with the Beatles, but jolly nearly.
And a particular Kinks track?
Waterloo Sunset, I think. Yeah.
And so there we have it. Can I just, before thanking Craig, remind everybody that we have Nick Heitner coming up, Philippe Sands, and Angie Hunter talking about on 9/11 itself, about what that was like being with inside Number 10 and on that day that appeared to be the turning point in the world history. And was. Craig, thank you very much indeed, from the enormously wide audience. I tried to get through all the questions, didn't get through all of them, but got through, I hope, most of them. And thank you very much for the questions. But Craig, above all, thank you very, very much indeed. That was vastly.
Thank you. Well, I'm not very good at thinking on my feet, which is one of the reasons I'm a writer. But I did my best.
You most certainly did, and you thought. Very quickly and very stimulatingly too. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
We loved having you. Thank you very much indeed.